Good morning, everyone. Thank you for choosing to attend this session. Realise you probably had a choice, so thank you. As Rory mentioned briefly, I'm going to be speaking briefly today about a situation that I hope some of you are familiar with. That's namely that a lot of us really have problems to actually access accurate spend data in our organisations, specifically so that we and our organisations can base valid strategic decisions on that data. Now, a lot of the time the data is present in the organisation, but our problem is A, getting to the data, making sure that people actually share it with us, B, then classifying and translating that data, and then C, maybe even visualising that data in an appropriate way that means that we can actually have actionable insights from it. Now, I struggled with this for a number of years in TUI specifically, and in other organisations, to be honest. But what I'd like to speak to you today about is how I tackled that problem in TUI. I won't say it's a best-in-class solution. I won't say that I've got all the answers and you should do exactly as I've done. But I'll simply tell you the thought process that I went through, what we actually did, and if that helps you, then great. If it doesn't, then hopefully I've only wasted 35 minutes of your time. So firstly, let's get the company bump out of the way. What about TUI? Well, Rory's mentioned we fly some aircraft. We've got about 140 aircraft that we use to fly mostly European customers around the world, mostly on European holidays, sometimes long haul to the Caribbean. It basically takes people from cold countries in Europe to hot places where they can lie on the beach, what we call sun and beach holidays or sun and stay holidays. But TUI used to make about 80% of its revenues from that. Recently, from our merger in 2014, we've actually started making a lot more money from cruise businesses. Believe it or not, that cruise businesses are growing in Europe and not just for pensioners. As of last financial year, we were just approaching making 50% of our EBITDA from our owned hotels and our cruise businesses. So really seeing a 50-50 split between package holidays, hotels and cruises. TUI, as well as the 140 aircraft, we've got about 16 cruise ships in total at the moment. With recent disposals and mergers and acquisitions, we've got a turnover of about 18 billion euros per year. But travel is incredibly competitive, so we only make around about 1 billion EBITDA euros per year. Fairly low margin. The good thing is that's our highest margin in quite a long time, to be honest with you. We've been on a 3-year 10% EBITDA year-on-year growth, as promised by the CEO recently. I think when I joined TUI in 2011, we were at less than 200 million euros EBITDA, so definitely a big improvement. So mentioned I joined TUI in 2011. In 2014, when TUI Travel PLC and TUI AG merged, we created what's called TUI Group. I became the Group Procurement Director at that time. As some of you will have heard when I spoke here last year, I'm quite pleased to say that I'm one of the few non-German nationals that report directly into the board. I'm also the last standing Englishman since that merger. So hopefully I'm doing something right, or I'm just flying under the radar. I don't know. Prior to TUI, I have worked in a number of procurement roles. Also worked in various other roles in academia, defence, you name it. I'm quite glad to be here. I have a major passion in my life that takes up a lot of my time when I'm not at work. That's that I race superbikes in a national championship. I say I'm glad to be here. Unfortunately, I had a nasty incident on Saturday where my brakes failed at over 150 miles an hour and punted me off the track. Luckily, I walked away uninjured and went on to get third place yesterday. Now, back to the main topic. So, spoke about data and getting access to the data. Why the fishing picture? Well, I sometimes think as CPOs, heads of procurement directors, you name it, We're often swimming in a sea of data. The data's all around us in the company, if only we know which lines or laws or nets to use to actually capture that right data. I think a lot of you have probably come across the situation where you've joined a company where you start asking questions about what supplier or spend or supply chain data is available. And if you've had the same experiences as me, you'll get a number of PowerPoints or Excel files that are sent to you, often that are very much out of date. They might have been created 2, 3, 4 years ago. I think it was Caroline that mentioned, about out-of-date supply chain strategies. Quite common. People create these things and then they put them on, on a figurative shelf. In some organisations, I've seen it where supplier dossiers have been brought out and it's yellowing printouts, paper folders. They're actually giving you your insights on your suppliers. And that's incredibly frustrating coming into an organisation because you want access to real-time data. When you do want the latest data, if you're not in an organisation that's really got its act together with regards to reporting, then you're often going into manual data collection processes. Yeah? You're sending teams of analysts out to interview the businesses, to convince the businesses to give up their data so that you can then compile it and try and get some insights out of it. Certainly that was the case that I was in. And it does mean that if the executive or the management asks you a question that you haven't been asked recently, or you haven't thought about in exactly that way, you're having to launch a new data collection request, collect the data in a slightly different way or interpret it in a slightly different way to answer that exact question. And you don't have those instant answers to hand that you would quite often like to do. Now, if that's frustrating as a CPO, I would argue that it's even more frustrating for the buyers, because the buyers are the ones that are wanting access to data even more than you are, because they're wanting it on a daily basis. When they go into a negotiation with a supplier, they want to know how much did we spend in the last 3, 6, and 12 months, and exactly what was that on. Yeah? And they want to know that across all the business units, not just the local business unit that they're in or in the head office. Now, spoke about manual data collection. My experience in TUI is that quite often to collect spend data across more than 200 business units, we were going through data collection cycles between 2 and 6 months to fully get a mature view of the business. What we were having to do is go out to local finance directors and CFOs, convince them to give us their latest data, make sure that they'd removed certain items from that data, because quite often when you're collecting spend data, you'll get things like direct payments or expense payments come up. Maybe don't want to be shared cross-border or just don't want to be shared full stop. You also tend to get those certain business units that never like sharing data, either because it's too difficult, just that they don't want to collaborate with procurement maybe, or that they don't want to give up some of their local secrets. Yeah? And those last sort of bastions tend to be the ones that you never really get any insight into. As you'll all know, you then get additional issues when you're collecting this data, that there's no consistency in how the data is provided to you. If you've got a diverse group of companies, then they'll all be classifying the spend differently, if they're classifying it at all. Quite often you're only relying on the financial accounting classification of that data in what's been provided to you. In the supplier name, I'm sure a lot of you have come across this. You all may speak about how many suppliers you've got, but how many times have you actually gone down to how many unique suppliers is that? And how many common suppliers are there? You might have, I've seen, I think, the largest number, probably about 120 different versions of British Telecoms, BT, listed on supplier lists, because they're all different offices in different geographies in the UK, all different places that invoices are being received from. That's just one supplier. Now that's an easy one to spot, but when you take for example, management consultancies, and you look at a Deloitte or a KPMG or a PwC around the world, taking all their different invoicing offices and all their different name variants in local languages, it can be quite hard to actually consolidate those and see that it's actually just one supplier that you're dealing with. So that needs to be thought about as well. The other thing that I tended to see with manual data collection is quite often you get too many arguments about what is the single version of the truth. If you're doing a manual data collection over 2, 3, 4 months, and then you've got a financial accounting view, which is how they've done the quarter end or the year end, reported the data in a different way, or maybe even a local stakeholders view on just how their budget is reported to them, you get into quite a lot of debates about what is actually the true spend figure that you're trying to present. And you can get into more arguments about whether it's the right figure or not than actually what should we do about this data, this insight. The final thing that I'd say about the manual data collection process is that I've been guilty of this a lot in my career, even though I try to pay attention to it. We tend to ask people for a lot of data. We spend a lot of time collecting that data and then analysing it and putting it together. But quite often that process can take so long that we actually forget to show the results back to the people who gave us the data in the first place. And the next time you go back to that person is maybe in a year's time when you need the data again. And that's a really unrewarding process for the person that's actually took the time to give you that data in the first place. So we need to break that cycle. So what did we do in TUI? Well, the first thing we did was to separate analytics from sourcing. So in TUI, we focus mostly on strategic sourcing. So we look at a procurement team that sourced the big deals, and we park transactional procurement a little bit. But we wanted the people doing the strategic sourcing to not have to worry about analysing the data. So I could say that I outsourced analytics to a company in India, but I really hate the word outsourced because it doesn't describe what we did. I would say we tasked a company in India that we chose as our partner to deliver the analytics in collaboration with our buyers that were delivering the strategic sourcing. Okay? Because what we didn't do is give this company a whole lot of processes or rules to follow and say, okay, you do this and we'll do that. What we did do is we said, we would like you to do this analytics piece, but we want you to work in collaboration with our buyers and we will work together for common goals. Okay? Effectively, we body shopped the people in India and then we said, you become part of our team. Okay? Now, that's taken years to mature. It does work very well, but it takes a lot of investment. So personally, I'll spend 2 weeks per year out in India, spending time with that team, making sure that they're fully up to speed with our strategy as a business, making sure they understand what our buyers are looking for, making sure that they're motivated to work on behalf of TUI and working to help us achieve the same goals. Now, one lesson we did learn from that process, I would say, is that if you're, even with all that investment, if you're not careful, you can create a bit of a them versus us relationship. You may not see it as an outsourcing relationship, but maybe the buyers do. And you'll tend to get this ongoing problem where people throw issues over the fence, or they start blaming India because they haven't had a response within 2 hours to an urgent email that they sent. You really need to try and break that down. One of the things that we did to try and prevent that is we actually specifically did not put SLAs in place, okay? Because we felt that creating SLAs between the buyers and the analysts turned it into a them versus us outsource relationship approach. whereas we wanted it to be working more as a team. And it's very rare that two people in the same team will have an SLA between them for how they interact. So that was one thing. Two, we started pairing up analysts and buyers. So specific pairings of buyer analysts, making sure that they were speaking at least on a weekly basis, ideally on a daily basis, working on common goals. Okay. Because unless the buyers were speaking to the analysts and vice versa, what we found was that the buyers would just then spend all their time on the negotiation. The analysts would spend all their time on just looking at data, but everybody would forget about doing some of the more strategic things, such as looking at category strategies, looking at any actionable opportunities that arose from the data, and so on. Okay, so we had the analytics and the sourcing sorted out. We then needed to look at how we were going to go about getting data and forming insights on it. Now, within TUI, we already had quite a number of tools already. We have been using SAP sourcing, what used to be frictionless, for a number of years for contract management, for projects and reporting, for RFX. That works fine, but it's not a transactional system. It doesn't hold any spend data. We had Oracle Procurement, which was used as a transactional system for around about 40% of the companies. We had a plan to change that to SAP SRM. Originally, I think it was an 18-month plan to change that. It's now in its 6th year. Glad to say it's finally coming to an end. Great to implement a relatively best-in-class transactional procurement system, but only covering 40% of the companies. So you can imagine that doing the reporting out of SAP is great, but yeah, you're seeing 4 out of 10 companies in effect. When I looked at things, we also had already a traditional business data warehousing system. But that actually only took data from half the finance systems that were already in place. So roughly covered about 25% of the company. And my view is really, what's the point in reporting on 25% of the company? You may have real-time reports that are coming up, but nobody is going to recognise those figures if you try and present it where it's got so much missing. And that system was going end of life anyway, to be honest with you, so we decided to scrap that. So based on all those things, that the only common system across the group had no spend data. The new procurement systems we were putting in only covered 40% of the company, and the existing data warehouse that we had didn't cover everybody and was going out of date anyway. We realised that we needed a new unifying platform, and we needed something flexible that would cope with the amount of mergers and acquisitions and disposals that quite commonly happen in a group of TUI's size. So what did we do? I'm sure you know the answer. We launched an RFP. Really original. Now, some of the people involved in that RFP may or may not be in this room today. Certainly may be in the building, so I won't mention any names. But I'll just talk about the general process. Okay. The first thing that I did was make sure that I tasked a member of my team to actually run the RFP with myself as the customer. Okay. And that team member was fully responsible for running the RFP from start to finish, as if I was somebody who knew nothing about procurement. And I would honestly really recommend that process, because you truly get to see how your customer is treated by one of your buyers and how much value they add and how much they take the lead. Because a lot of the time in our roles, we are expecting from our buyers a certain amount of proactivity, a certain amount of project management, lead and coordination. Put yourself in that position and see how they do. It's really interesting. But we went through the normal thing. We had an RFP, we had a long list of suppliers, we shortlisted them, we went through a number of rounds of bidding, eventually best and final offers. Some of the key insights that we saw is, first of all the bids that we were getting were way in excess of the budget that we'd actually deemed appropriate to this opportunity. So we were really struggling. We were also finding that the accuracy of these systems in classifying spend was not as high as we hoped it would be. There was a lot of optimism within the project group that the new systems would be able to deliver really high levels of spend classification automated out of the box, or certainly after a period of learning or iteration. And we just weren't hitting that. What we were seeing is that with English language data, we were typically seeing success rates in classification of between 50 and 80%, roughly. That actually decreased when we started to introduce any of the 8 other languages that we needed to classify. And the ultimate conclusion was that no matter which solution we chose, even if we chose the best-in-class solution, we would still need 3 or 4 FTEs to help do manual classification after the automatic spend classification had finished, because otherwise we wouldn't have the level of confidence in the data that we needed. That created an additional budget challenge as well. The other thing we saw, of course, was that with a lot of these solutions, they are software solutions. People are after recognising as much revenue as they can when they sign the contract. So a lot of the costs start 100% on day one when you sign the contract. Some of the alternatives that we looked at that I'll speak about in a moment allowed us a much more gradual ramp up and therefore a much more gradual increase in costs. Now, I mentioned 50 to 80% accuracy. You may wonder why the picture there, but quite a few years ago I actually worked in defence, and there was a really interesting story that was described to me. In that a lot of you may remember from the 1990s, we had these videos of the cruise missiles in the Gulf War that were supposedly highly accurate. They were flying down chimneys, they were going in through windows, and they were really described as really high precision munitions. The sad reality of the 1990s Gulf War is that a lot of those missiles were only accurate to within 10 or 20 metres, quite often plus or minus 100 metres. So there was a lot of collateral damage when these missiles were fired at enemy positions. Since that time, and really the Gulf War was one of the first wars that was really played out live on TV, a lot of governments worldwide have invested a lot of money in increasing accuracy of munitions. So now, or certainly even 10 years ago, a lot of precision munitions that were being used had an accuracy of plus or minus 1 metre. True through the window type accuracy. Now, the governments do that because simply the cost of hitting the wrong target is too high, morally and financially. They don't want to be doing that. But in terms of procurement and spend visibility, we've got this trade-off to play in terms of, well, how much accuracy do we want from a solution when we're talking about classifying spend data? How much can we afford to pay? And how quickly do we need that accuracy as well? Because you might have a really cheap missile that's really accurate, but if it arrives at the target after the enemy's already left, it's no good. And it's very similar with something like a spend classification platform. You can have a cheap solution that takes cheap, even manual solution that takes a long time to arrive at the conclusion. But if it's too late to actually base insights on it, what's the point? So we had a look at a few internal options as well, and we tasked the internal IT department and said, well, what can you do better than these external suppliers? And unfortunately, a lot of the solutions that they came back with were really over-engineered. So some of the external solutions were maybe 2-3 times the budget that we'd allocated. Some of the internal solutions that were created were actually 3 to 4 times the budget that we'd allocated. Really over-engineered. So we went back to basics, actually, and we used our partner in India to say, okay, well, what can we do as a minimum viable product, to lend an agile term, to really get this going quickly, cheaply, and practically. And one of the groundbreaking moments, I think, is when we thought about how much we were looking at spending on these external solutions. We actually concluded, well, why don't we just throw a number of people at this? With what we would spend on an external solution, even with a small amount for hosting, we could still throw 5, 6, 7, 8 FTEs at this. And it would still be cheaper than buying an external software platform. So we started looking at that. To cut a long story short, when we went through all the different analysis and the options, it was actually the most cost-effective, but also gave the best solution for our needs to start ramping up a team of analysts in India based on together with a specific software platform of three specific softwares, which I'll speak about, and simply build our own solution. So that's what we did. Now, for the technical among you, basically what we do is we get the data from our local finance departments using SFTP uploads. We host everything on Amazon Web Services, located in the EU, so we don't have data protection issues there. And then we use a couple of software tools called Tableau and Pentaho. Okay? Pentaho for ETL, extraction, transformation, and loading of data into the platform, and Tableau for visualization. The hosting, the software costs, it's all done on a software as a service basis, and we pay less than £15,000 per year for the hosting and software in total. Okay, so virtually nothing. We also have the option to turn on or off that platform as we wish. With AWS, you can effectively flick a switch to switch your costs on or off, which is great because it doesn't take a lot to put in a pre-programmed routine to only switch that stuff on between 9 and 5 business hours, and therefore save you the costs overnight when nobody's using it. So that was great. We created a technical proof of concept using these software tools that worked. We then needed to get the data in. What we did is, or I did, was I went to the CFO and said, okay, look, I need your approval for this. But the big difference here was I didn't go to the CFO saying, okay, I need your approval for a big budget to start implementing this software solution over 3 years, and it's going to cost me €500,000. All I did was I went to the CFO with a 1-pager for approval. And that was simply saying, give me your commitment that your finance department will give me their data in any format that they can find. And they don't have to do any work apart from send me that data. That was it. The reason I did that was I've worked in so many companies where you ask finance departments for data, but you ask them for it in a really prescribed manner. And if you are too heavy on your requirements with what you ask for, it becomes too difficult for people to give you the data because they've got to do manual work to transform it. If you say to people, just give me your data in any format you've got, it makes it a lot harder for them to say no. So I simply said, give us the data, we'll do the heavy lifting. And that actually worked really well. To date, it took us about 6 months to go around the various departments and just make sure that they were providing the data on a monthly basis as we required. But we've got 100% coverage across the companies within 6 months. In terms of FTEs, we've managed to ramp the FTEs up in India. We estimated that we needed 5.3 FTEs at maturity of the solution. We're actually only at 3.5, so we're still under budget in terms of that. I think we're coming close to time, so I'll just try and close up. What I will say was, it was a bit of a leap of faith to go for building our own solution rather than selecting one off the shelf. Took a bit of guts to actually say, no, we're not going to go for that solution, we're going to build it internally. But it went really, really well. We went live in March to our end users. We gave them iPad clients as well as desktop clients. We gave them training. We've created bespoke reports for them. They can go in and add and amend their own reports, which is great. And people are using it every day for actionable insights. What I will say, though, is that with a lot of these solutions, people still need to be fairly digitally savvy in order to get the best out of the reporting. Okay? People need to understand how reports work and how to modify them in order to get the insights out, because it's just the way it works. This is why people pay so much for data scientists in organisations. Yeah? So you need to make sure that your buyers are adequately trained and digitally savvy enough about these sorts of things in order to get the most out of it. I would also say invest heavily in change management and that training. I saw in my project team, the project team was so focused on getting the data and getting the data classified that they forgot about the human impact on the buyers of actually rolling this out. A, the training, but also B, making sure that there was feedback loops in case of reclassification of data, making sure those processes were in place as well. So finally, just to conclude before any questions, and I realise it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Firstly, much as I hate Agile in terms of trying to procure companies that work in an Agile way with our IT organisations, the minimum viable product approach from the Agile methodology can work in this sort of situation. So start small, be prepared to fail quickly, but start small, get something in place and test it. Make sure you do a make versus buy type analysis. In our case, it was actually analysing, well, should we do this with an external company, internally, or make our own solution? And how much manual effort should we put into it? We concluded that doing it 100% manually gave us the best results for this particular scenario. Make sure you get your CFO's buy-in, but don't be afraid to do the heavy lifting. Okay? Make it as easy as possible for people to give you the data that you need. And finally, I would say maintain flexibility of your platform as well, because if you've got a company like mine that's always changing, you need to be able to cater for mergers, acquisitions and disposals, and to be able to change classifications and metadata, attributes of data and so on. So keep as much flexibility as you can. And finally, if you haven't done something like this already in your company and you recognise some of the problems that I've described, then get started as soon as possible.